So then, what was it all about? If Lucas didn't care, why get involved? If Lucas didn't consider it canon, why authorize its creation and publishing? It was about money. Howard Rothman, the son in the Holy Trilogy of Star Wars, the head of Lucas Licensing, had this to say after his retirement in a 2017 interview. Well, for that initial period of the original trilogy, we were doing great, but in 1983, when Return of the Jedi came out, George also announced that he was getting divorced and going out of the Star Wars business, that he wasn't going to make any Star Wars movies, and that kind of ground things to a halt. Obviously, the world didn't stop everything, our original audience was getting older, there was so much of our business was built around kids at that time, and kids grow up, and a new generation was moving in. There was a lot of competition in the marketplace all of a sudden. Syndicated television was coming on board, and that's where kids were gravitating to. And Star Wars sales just plummeted at that point. By 1985, you couldn't give away Star Wars merchandise. We had to make a decision to sort of go underground, just turn things down, not try to drive the market so much. It wasn't until the early 90s that we really started to look at how do we bring Star Wars back. That was the pivotal time where we evolved into something that was 100% driven by theatrical movies to something that was driven more by consumer products. In retrospect, I had a brilliant process. When it was happening at the time, it was sort of alive and evolving, but the basic framework was that we had to recognize that our audience evolved. So if you were a 10-year-old in 1977 when you saw the film originally, and that was kind of the core audience, certainly the audience that was buying the product, by 1990, or you're either finishing college, starting your career, starting a family, you're at a very different stage or life stage. And we started thinking if people are still interested in Star Wars, what would interest them at that stage of their life? And that's when we started to think about things like continuing some of the stories of the characters in the films through novels, because we at that point were out of the theatrical film business. So we looked at publishing as a very important way of re-engaging the audience at this new life stage. There have always been things we've said no. We've got so many proposals for different things. I mean, one of the temptations of something as ubiquitous and powerful as Star Wars is that everybody wants a piece of it. So there's a lot of greed at work and over enthusiasm and maybe things that, just aren't right for the brand. This was a 2017 interview after his retirement. So, yes, I know some EU purists may hate when anti EU fans bring up this approach, but it's not me making this argument. It's Howard Rothman. I'm just sharing what he said. And the mentality was there before Disney and his retirement. It's not him rewriting history. Referring to Star Wars, it was an unstoppable locomotive, and then a funny thing happened. All of a sudden, it stopped. George Lucas stopped making Star Wars movies. Little boys stopped buying Star Wars toys, and people stopped interacting with the franchise. By 1986, you couldn't give the toys away. The original audience had aged out of it, and the next group of kids was on to the Masters of the Universe and the new G.I. Joe and lots of other things, and that was the exact time that I got promoted to be the head of licensing. Not a great time to get that job. I don't know if you've ever tried to sell anything that people didn't want, but I thought, no, I'll show them. I'll be the greatest salesman that ever lived. So I went out to every retailer and every licensee trying to convince them to restock Star Wars. And to one, they told me, kid, Star Wars is dead. So I had to go back to George Lucas and deliver the news. Needless to say, that was a meeting I wasn't looking forward to. I really thought it was going to be one of those situations where he pushes the button and your chair falls through the floor into the tank of piranhas. So I'll never forget. I walked into his office and I said, George, I hate to tell you this, but Star Wars is dead. And he looked at me and narrowed his eyes and he said, no, it's not dead. It's just taking a rest. A lot of kids really love those movies. Someday they're going to grow up and start having kids of their own. We could bring it back then. As a side note, if EU purists really want to try to put Howard up as the son in the holy trinity of Star Wars, while they simultaneously bash Dave Filoni as someone who can't be trusted or a betrayer of George or a hack, here's what Howard had to say in that same interview about George. When asked who shot first, Howard responded, I think it's really clear. Look, that was a very unpleasant controversy. Clearly, Han shot first. George went through this little moment in the course of doing the special edition in 1997 where he questioned the morality of that. He maybe should have questioned more what Han Solo's character was. Try finding a video of Dave Filoni questioning George's understanding of Star Wars and its core characters publicly like that. Like, that's kind of wild and crazy to me. So, the real reason George kept tabs on the EU while also keeping a distance, if it was clearly advertised as an alternate universe that didn't adhere to the films but was straight up alternate reality, like one might think of when they hear that term, the EU probably wouldn't sell and the company wouldn't make money. This is probably why in the Splinter forward he described the stories as being part of the saga, even though he didn't really see it that way. Going into the prequels, financing was the key, seeing as George was financing not just the special editions of the classic films, but all three prequels with his own pocketbooks. Howard said when George was said he was going back to make the prequel trilogy, the first one would be released in 1997, and that got moved to 1998, and then finally got moved to 1999. It completely wreaked havoc with all of our plans with most of my life and at that point, but it also forced us to come up with other ideas for what do you do to keep the plate spinning. What do you do to keep the audience engaged? Because we were very conscious of moving from this period that was driven by consumer products into a period that was once again going to be driven by theatrical films, in the prospect of deeply engaging a new generation. J.W. Rinsler, who interviewed Lucas for several biographies, keep in mind, said George had a very healthy attitude towards the EU and licensing in general. I mean, licensing starting after episode 1 just became this juggernaut that was making just truckloads and truckloads of money for Lucasfilm. So you don't bother licensing. And he had good lieutenants running licensing, and they would just ask him, if something in particular maybe George might care about, and basically George would give everyone a full head of steam. His attitude was do what you want, don't talk about Yoda, or for this movie, I'm going to be doing that, so don't talk about that. And that was it. You did your thing, and he did his thing. And then if it contradicted the EU, Leland would get together with publishing and say, how can we fix this? And come up with some retro reverse engineered fit. I mean, it was make believe. It is make believe. So people didn't get very uptight about it. While George has always been passionate about telling his stories that are in his movies, and he made great films while doing so, he's still a businessman and smart about marketing. He's just not soulless while doing it, like other corporate and Hollywood hacks. He has stated that he intentionally put Star Wars as an early summer release, even though he was advised against it, with the idea that kids would see the movie, go to school, talk about it with their friends, and spread the word so more kids would go see it. He got himself into the position to take merchandising and sequel rights so that when time came to make the next Star Wars movies after A New Hope, he could fund it himself with the merchandising revenue and retain studio independence. He literally said the '03 Clone Wars was supposed to function as commercials until the animators pushed back and got at least a 2 to 3 minute runtime. Why would George Lucas step in and order Genndy to put the Battle of Coruscant in the final episodes? Because then kids would watch it and want to go see the movie to see how it all wraps up. Same principle with Labyrinth of Evil, which is probably why that was the only publishing story from the Clone Wars multimedia project where the story idea came directly from him, as it would tie straight into the film. And if anyone brings up the Shatterpoint, same thing. He gave some basic words about the war to kick off the Clone Wars multimedia project, which helped generate revenue for the final prequel trilogy film. According to Noah Falstein, Lucas gave 3 specific directives, and this is with LucasArts: stay small, be the best, and don't lose any money. Seeing as the EU was launching around the same time that Lucas had decided to go back and do the prequels, of course he would give his permission. The company had been dormant on the Star Wars front since 1985. Doing the EU would help generate income for the prequels. Considering Howard pitched it to him in the same way Star Trek functioned, why would he refuse? The truth is, the EU wasn't really much more than a marketing tactic for Lucasfilm to finance films and other endeavors. To do so successfully required a certain level of oversight and quality by Lucas to make sure it lived up to the brand of Star Wars. Lucas, Howard Rothman, Sue Rustoni, and many others have demonstrated that the EU was never meant to be part of George's canon. It was all part of licensing. George's stories he has personally been involved with have always contradicted the EU to one degree or another. George's Star Wars canon was the 6 live-action Star Wars episodes and Star Wars The Clone Wars. To close out, I just wanted to give my own personal thoughts and take regarding the EU. Some might take this video to mean I hate the EU or I have an agenda against anyone who loves it. That's simply not true. I actually love the idea of the EU, and I honestly envy anyone who grew up with that. Being a Star Wars fan growing up in the 90s would have been a sick time to be a Star Wars fan, and part of me honestly wishes I could have experienced that and jumped headfirst into the beautiful stories of the EU in the early 90s and the early 2000s. I haven't read a lot of it, but I have read some stuff, like the Quinlan Vos omnibus of comics, Rogue Planet, Darth Plagueis, a few TCW tie-ins, several Dark Horse comics from pre-Phantom Menace and between episodes 4 and 5, and a few of the Last of the Jedi books, and most of that I liked. And I've watched all the on-screen stuff, like droids in the Ewok movies. I read the Thrawn trilogy for the first time in 2023, and I actually enjoyed it. And I fully admitted to anyone who asked me what I thought that if I had read that in the 90s, I would have gobbled that up.
And yeah, I do keep up with the Disney stuff. But that doesn't mean I'm a shill with an agenda against the EU. I don't like all the Disney stuff, and a lot of it is really mid. But the stuff I do really love, like Rebels and Rogue One, I can sit here and still enjoy them as film and television products, as stories, and as entries in the Star Wars franchise, while happily admitting that I know it doesn't come from George Lucas, or it's not part of his vision for Star Wars per se. I can make arguments on why I think it fits, but that doesn't change the fact that he didn't make it. His involvement shouldn't be the only determining factor in your enjoyment of a story. And for anyone who thinks the EU can only be authentic or enjoyed if Lucas counted it as his personal vision for Star Wars is honestly straight up disrespectful to those authors who told those stories. But more importantly than my thoughts on the EU and Disney, I wholeheartedly love George Lucas's Star Wars saga. I have some minor criticisms, more specifically with Attack of the Clones or a few of the things in Return of the Jedi, but I wholeheartedly love George Lucas's Star Wars world and his stories that were presented to us via the original trilogy, the prequel trilogy, and the Clone Wars. And I'm really bummed that we did not get to see Star Wars through the lens of what he had in store for Star Wars Underworld and the sequel trilogy. I really desperately hope that someday those treatments and those scripts get released to us. I would very much like to see what George Lucas had to say about those eras. But more importantly than just my thoughts on George Lucas's Star Wars, I just love and respect George Lucas as a filmmaker. The more I've deep dived into him and studied him over the last few years, the more I just admire him and respect him. He's been such a great inspiration and a role model to me, especially as I've made my own short films and built my own little YouTube channel. And I didn't put all this together to hate on the people that love the EU. That by all means had nothing to do with it. I did all this because I respect and love George Lucas, and I want what he thought was Star Wars to be accurately represented and portrayed. And I won't stand for anyone falsely claiming that either the EU stuff or the Disney stuff was his true vision of Star Wars. Sure, maybe elements seep through from time to time in both of those cases, and sure, maybe you could try and reconcile a lot of that with his vision for Star Wars, but it's not the true thing. And I want George Lucas accurately represented because after all he's given us, I mean, the movie industry wouldn't be the way it is if it wasn't for him. Special effects, none of that. We owe modern day filmmaking and television and storytelling in Hollywood all to George Lucas. And because of that, I feel the man deserves to be accurately represented, and that's why I did all this. So to close, I don't care if any of these EU channels like Wars-Skran and some of the others keep talking about the EU. By all means, keep going. Keep talking about the EU, keep loving it, keep diving into it. I don't care. They can even say that they're talking about the EU as Star Wars lore that's better than what Disney's doing. Go for it. I don't care. They just can't keep going forward saying that the EU was the true version of George Lucas's Star Wars. Because the truth is, it wasn't. True George Lucas Star Wars was Star Wars Episodes 1 through 6 and Star Wars The Clone Wars. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to the channel. If you liked the video, comment down below and hit that like button. Oh, and check out some of my other videos. I'm sure you'll find them delight.